How many of the people in your organization or on your team feel confident that they can show up at work every day with just as much of a chance of being successful as anyone else, no matter who they are or what they look like? For this episode of Moments of Truth, I sat down with Dr. Tiffany Jana, author of Erasing Institutional Bias, to better understand how the dynamics of privilege work within organizations. Fasten your seatbelts. Tiffany doesn't mince words. And grab a pen and take good notes because her brilliance is bottomless. One of the findings in our research, Tiffany, was on the issue of accountability. That when accountability systems are seen to be unjust and unfair, meaning the way my contribution is measured is not seen to be balanced, you're 4 times more likely to have people lie, cheat, and behave with self-interest. In your book, you do a masterful job of unpacking all the systemic biases that shape the experience of the workplace. So first of all, I'd love for you to talk about when you think about systemic bias, talk about what you mean by that, because it has many meanings. And then I want you to hear about when you think about accountability systems, not the payment part, but just the contribution part. What are you seeing that how those biases leak in to our accountability processes?
Yeah, so systemic bias is the bias that is embedded into the systems and structures that we build, because as human beings, we are inherently biased, and that is not that's not a moral judgment. That is just a function of the human brain. And so if people are biased, then so are the systems that we build. So when we build those systems, we have a tendency to build in our preferences and build in policies, procedures, and systems that continue to privilege the things that we want privileged, or privilege the identities with which we are familiar or that represent us, that privilege ways of being. So there's so many different ways to do it. Like a very simple one is, the number one source of employees is referral systems, right? And so if you have an organization that happens to have been founded by, we're just going to go ahead and say a bunch of white men, then the network of those white men is probably going to be overpopulated, overrepresented in terms of other white men. And if we make it our business to do reaching out and recruiting, then we will often go to our alma maters. We'll go to the schools that we're familiar with. And what we'll find there is more replication of identities that reflect our own. I like to look at equity, like human equity, participation equity. And that is, regardless of the demographics and the identities that I show up with, can I have just as much of a likelihood as any other person to be successful? So you can't really see my blue hair right now because so much has grown out in the pandemic, but I usually rock a big blue afro. And I have 5 intersectional identities. So I'm LGBT, English is not my first language, I have an invisible disability, I am African American, and I'm non-binary. So, and I happen to have blue hair on top of that to make it more complicated. So if I show up in your organization, am I just as likely as anyone else of any other identity to be able to be successful? Am I going to get similar mentorships and sponsorships? Am I going to be given high profile and choice assignments that groom me for the next place? Am I going to get promotions? Am I going to, pay equity is real too, right? Am I, for doing the same job or similar job, will I be compensated on par with my peers of the other demographics? So accountability is about, sort of treating people similarly across the board, creating opportunities for everybody to be successful, and not, overtly privileging different aspects, particularly aspects of identity that don't have anything to do with the work. I would never tell anyone to hire someone because they are from an underrepresented demographic, right? That cannot be the first and only reason. First, they've got to be qualified to do the job, and they need to be the best qualified to do the job, frankly. However, if you've got multiple candidates and you've got 3 that represent demographics that are currently highly overrepresented in your organization, and you have 1 or 2 that come from demographics that you currently don't have a strong population of in your organization, these perspectives on top of their experience are like additional advanced degrees, right? So being Asian, being Black, being a woman, being queer, all of these things are going to add so much dimension, so much depth, and so much value to your organization that you need to see it as another line item on a resume and privilege that identity as something that the organization will derive value from.
When you think about retribution bias and our accountability systems in our organizations, what do you see intersecting there?
I would say that that retribution bias is still it's an inherent bias, and it is a way of thinking. It's a way of approaching things, and it does play out, and it does have a tendency to continue to, in this case, it's not privilege. It has a tendency to undermine the success of underappreciated demographics. The cultural communication that comes from particularly Black women is one that is passionate, that is emphatic, that is full of emotion. And that simply means that we are highly engaged and invested in the outcome, not that we are angry, but we are perpetually punished in the workplace for, speaking out of turn or being too passionate or using that particular tone with our boss or our colleague or whatever. And we are denied opportunities and seen as problematic and seen as troublemakers for simply engaging with the problem and trying to make the organization better by naming the thing, because culturally, we as a people are a people who don't run away from the problem. We name it, we claim it, we say something about it, and then we go straight for it. And try to actually deal with it and address it. And that is seen as troublesome in the context of some organizations. So how we think about people and their potential actually does affect their performance. And so when we have a societal set of structures and ideas that devalue certain populations, managers and supervisors will have a tendency to be looking for every problem that's going to come from a given population. And if you look for problems, you're going to find something.
When people perceive that who you say you are and what you do don't match, and you've institutionalized duplicity, you're now 3 times more likely to have people lie, withhold the truth, or behave unfairly. So when I think about the people who are in disadvantaged groups or underrepresented groups, when they are in organizations that make those claims, that don't live by them, what is the experience like for them? How do they experience that disconnect?
So it's experienced on multiple levels. And I think the most poignant example right now is going to be, I actually just wrote a piece called How to Avoid Corporate Blackwashing, right? And that is moving beyond the Black Lives Matter statement into accountable action, right? So to me, I think that the spectrum of organizational, that kind of diversity went before COVID, before this new movement, went from having a diversity statement to having a chief diversity officer. And now it's having a Black Lives Matter statement to community reparations, right? It's like, where do people fall on this spectrum? Because words are easy. They're the very first step, but absent action, the words mean nothing. So if you happen to have a diversity statement and you're lucky enough to have some representative diversity in terms of demographics at the organization, the people who work with you and for you are the first people to suffer. If you are not living into those values, then you are, essentially running a sham and treating your people in ways that do not reflect those values. And believe you me, they're talking amongst themselves, and the evidence of that failure is going to show up in the form of complaints, EEOC and otherwise, and a revolving door of people from diverse populations who are leaving and finding opportunities where they do feel more welcomed and do feel more safe. If you are treating your underrepresented demographics poorly within the workplace, you better believe that word gets out. Right. So right now, I'm one of the foremost diversity practitioners in the world, because I actually do build DEI ROI into all of my practices and processes. And I'm aware of a lot of organizational dirty laundry. Even if I've never worked with them, employees find people like me all the time, and they let us know exactly what's happening in that organization. Your constituency, your stakeholders will become aware of how you are treating people. And then if you have this diversity statement and it in any way reflects the people who you serve and you're not actually doing the thing, right? So you're blackwashing, you have a BLM statement and you talk about how it all matters, but you are continually causing harm within these communities, Your industry is causing harm. Your company is causing harm. You are not listening to the voice of the people when they raise their hands and they say, hey, this troubles us and this harms us. What are you going to do about it? Eventually, it will affect your bottom line.
So when people want, and each cognitive diversity and identity diversity are certainly two really important forms of difference, right? You just don't get in the same way. When you see people trying to establish both, how do you explain the difference to them? And the roles they play?
Yeah. I mean, at TMI Consulting, we define diversity as all of the ways that we are both similar and different. Now, focusing on identity diversity at the expense of cognitive diversity is problematic. I understand the impetus for the shortcut because we do have evidence to indicate that identity diversity does tend to indicate underlying cognitive diversity based on experiences and all kinds of different things. It's not 100%, it's not 100% guaranteed to work that way. When I was anybody's hire, I may have given them the visible diversity and some of the invisible diversity in my 5 intersectional identities. But the absolute truth of the matter is that I was raised like a middle-class white boy in America. I had the most expensive educations that money could buy. I went to entirely white schools. I am an avid test taker. I've taken so many tests. I took the LSAT because I could. I took the insurance test for the state of Virginia because I heard it was hard. I love taking tests. I eat them up for breakfast, but I had the education that advantaged me, and I had the cultural experience that allows me to navigate that biased system because I have a set of experiences that privilege my ability to navigate that particular world. So if you're looking for that kind of cognitive diversity, for me, the kind that overlays with identity and underprivileged identity, I'm sorry, but you're not going to get that. You're more likely to get something that falls in line with the usual suspects in the organization.
So how do we get organizations to be more analytically astute? How do we get people to say, dig deeper, work harder, and be more responsible? We have the data. It's not like we're short on data. How do we get organizations to understand the responsibility of seeing those patterns and acting upon them and being diligent and responsible with them?
We have developed a set of metrics where we can actually begin to show people what needs to be quantified, what does it mean, and then we do things like, we're cross-referencing 80 different organizational and interpersonal competencies and actually calibrating structural inclusion. So in many cases, you've got things that are going on in your system that are privileging certain identities, creating equity gaps, and it's literally embedded in your systems and structures and policies and procedures without the intention of doing so. Very rarely does anybody institute a policy with the express purpose of leaving some demographics behind. But this is the way we've always done it is a very sad excuse for why you're leaving people behind. So being willing to interrogate your systems, your structures, your policies, your procedures perpetually, like you don't stop doing that because from one moment to the next, things are changing. Look how fast the conversation in our world is changing about demographics, about anti-racism, et cetera. So a leadership team that is willing to interrogate their own systems and willing to stop looking in Snow White's mirror and getting a reflection that they'd like to see, but willing to look at a true and honest reflection and then put action behind course correction. That's the accountability, right? I believe that as leaders and as organizations, we have an imperative to take care of the human souls who have volunteered to come and spend their time with us in exchange for compensation. But I believe that taking care of them and making sure that we're not causing them harm day after day is part of our job. And failing to act on the data that we are able to collect in service of creating equitable systems and processes, that failure is a failure to take care of that human being.
One of the things I love what you said is we have to lean into the hard conversations. We can't avoid them. There's no shortage. They're right in front of us. When you come to all those we days, whether it's racially particularly, but any of them, anybody you've made a they, how do you get organizations to lean into those hard conversations and talk about what everybody's already talking about anyway?
Yeah, well, the first thing we have to scrap is that that notion that people need to leave their home stuff at home and bring their work stuff to work. That is utter garbage, right? That's like saying, please leave your your left leg at home and hop on in with the other one. We are all managing our own private battles all the time. Some of us are winning those battles, some of us not so much. But we have to be able to bring, like when you talk about some of the core purposes of focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion work, we talk about the ability to bring your whole self to work. And what we know, that whether we're talking about women having to button up and wear less jewelry and be less whatever, right, to fit in a more masculine world, and no tears, no emotions, professionalism is actually a placeholder for show up in the workplace like a white man. Like, think about it. It's really problematic. And so when people are having to perpetually cover themselves, their identities, their feelings, whatever it is, like, we know that there can be up to an 80% reduction in productivity when people can't actually be who they are. We now have studies that support the idea that organizations who are able to lean in and have the conversations about race are more profitable and more effective than organizations that don't. So the elephant is in the room, whether you're talking about him or not. So we want to be able to build the cultural fluency within our organization to be able to have these conversations, because it is the very things that we can teach in terms of skills around that cultural fluency that prevent us from landing on the front page for all the wrong reasons. If I can't talk to you about my racialized experience, about the biased experience that I feel like I'm having in the workplace, who am I going to talk to when the microaggression happens, the subtle act of exclusion happens? I'm going to talk to HR. I'm going to go to EEO. I'm going to make a federal thing out of it because I was told to not have this conversation at work, that it wasn't appropriate, or somehow made to feel that this was somehow outside of work. I had an experience the other day that I think this reminds me of. I posted something in the realm of my world on LinkedIn, and some white man somewhere said, "This is a great article for Facebook." And it was about race and racism in the workplace. And I said, interesting. I said, your bias is showing. LinkedIn is a professional platform. Anti-racism and diversity is my profession. And this is precisely the kind of content that people come to my page looking for from me. You're welcome to post whatever you like on your page, right? So this idea that we can't talk about this, that is obfuscating the reality of what is happening in the world, and more importantly, the reality of what is happening with your people. If your people are having a set of experiences that is diminishing their ability to be productive, that is diminishing their ability to feel like a full part of the team, you want to know about that, and you want to address it head on, because there's no reason that your institution cannot have these conversations well, other than a failure to be accountable to having these conversations well.
Thank you. Thank you for this time. It was, I knew it would be a spirited and brilliant conversation. It was even more so than I thought. So thank you for your good work on the world, Tiffany. I appreciate it a lot. And I look forward to watching you thrive and kick ass, take names.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you.
You take good care.
If you're a parent, this pandemic has likely hit you pretty hard. One study showed that parents in the United States have nearly doubled the time they were spending on education and household tasks before the coronavirus outbreak, to 59 hours per week, up from 30 hours a week. But this burden is not equal. Mothers spend 15 hours more on average a week than fathers. In this Everyday Justice segment, Jarrod Shappell talks with Elliot Haspel, co-founder of Dads Who Care, on what justice and equality, both in gender and ethnicity, can look like in the places closest to us, our homes. Take a listen.
Hello again, and welcome to Everyday Justice. I'm Jarrod Shappell, and this segment is all about introducing you to the people that I know who are advocating and organizing and really fighting for justice in their work, in their industry, in their cities, in their town. And today I have someone with me who I know so well, and I've known long before either of us had kids. We could just do whatever we wanted with our days. That is not the case anymore. And he is actually so much more than this, but also co-founder of a little thing that we started together called Dads Who Care. But one of my best friends, ladies and gentlemen, Elliot Haspel. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Jarrod.
Yeah, you bet. So I thought it would be interesting for us to start with Dads Who Care. There's so much more to your work and so much more to kind of how you think about justice in the realm of families and children and care. But, you know, you sent me a text, I don't know, 6 months ago, and you just said, why aren't dads organizing? And how do we organize dads around, you know, some of the inequitable situations facing our society today, specifically as it relates to parenting? And I was like, great idea, let's go. So tell me about what kind of motivated you to send that text and kind of how, you know, you see Dads Who Care being a voice of justice around some of the unjust things that you see.
Yeah, so I mean, it's not like news to anyone that the pandemic has been exacerbating existing gender inequities, right? Like mothers have been shouldering, you know, the burden of, you know, keeping up the household and having to deal with, you know, virtual school and having to deal with remote work, and all of the things are disproportionately falling on mothers' shoulders. And we know this, you know, stories anecdotally, we know this, there's data about it. There was a line just recently in a New York Times article, which I thought was very apt, and it basically said, like, America's fallback option is mothers. And I think everything goes wrong, we're just like, mothers are gonna pick up the slack. And so, you know, working in sort of the early childhood, child and family policy realm, I was very aware that there are several groups that work to organize moms and to, you know, you've got, and this goes back, right? Everyone knows Mothers Against Drunk Driving. You know, some people may be familiar with Moms Demand Action against gun violence. There's a group called Moms Rising, which is sort of multi-issue around trying to organize moms. And all of this, I was like, where are the dads? Like, where? And, you know, and as I was doing some research around it, the answer is really there is very, very little happening right now to organize fathers, particularly to advocate for equitable family policies. So there you can find groups where dads organize to like share, you know, fatherhood fellowship, you know, all the parenting tips. But this idea of like, actually, it should matter to dads just as much as moms that like we have paid family leave, that we have universal child care, that we have lactation support, like those sorts of things. Really was missing the dad voice. And I was like, all right, well, I'm gonna text my friend Jarrod and let's see if we can, you know, get some dads who care about this stuff to actually, you know, do something about it.
Yeah, you sent me the text and I was like, yes, absolutely, let's go. And I think we joke about this sometimes, but it's not actually a joke. We're two middle-aged white dudes. And I think in addition to the inequities on kind of the gender spectrum, there's also kind of the racial inequities. There's the socioeconomic inequities. Can you say more, again, you know, whether it's through the dad lens or just other work that you've done about how COVID is disproportionately impacting those communities and families, and any ideas or solutions that you have to work towards that end?
Yeah, so, you know, this is all intersecting, right? Like if COVID is basically like, you know, putting pressure on fault lines, and so if the fault lines exist already, there's a lot more likely to, you know, kind of get the big one. And so, you know, what we had, right, you already had a situation where disproportionately lower wage jobs are being done by people of color, right? Where people of color have less savings, they have less ability to work from home. Like that's a really big one, right? Like something like 10 or 15% of Black and Latino populations have the ability to work from home, which versus like 30 or 40% of white workers. And so all of a sudden, like in the middle of the pandemic, like that really matters when it comes to things like childcare, you know? And so what we saw is that, you know, particularly for parents of young children, there's data coming out of the University of Oregon that's been, you know, tracking basically a sample of these types of parents that among low-income families, among single parent families, among Black and Latino families, you know, upwards of 50 or 60% of them are getting to the point where they're worried about being able to cover basic expenses. We're talking like food, utilities, right? Like rent, mortgage, that kind of stuff. And it is just, I mean, really glaring when you see all of the all of the sort of ill-begotten fruits that we planted, over these centuries of racism and sexism and classism and all the rest of it, they're bearing fruit now, and we're seeing it really put the hammer down on families of color in particular.
Yeah. And I feel like I like the fault line earthquake analogy, and I think in some ways, this is being maybe a little too dark here, but like we see the rubble now, right? I mean, the earthquake, I mean, it might not be done. There's months left of this pandemic for sure. But when you think about rebuilding so that we have some resilience for this in the future, like what are the tenets of your manifesto? What are the levers that you think that we can pull to create a bit more equity, whether along gender lines or whether around kind of the ethnic lines? What would you be thinking are the things that would really make a difference today? Again, from a policy standpoint, social standpoint, everyday behavior.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up the different dimensions, and I think there needs to sort of be parallel tracks. So from a policy standpoint, right, there are a few this is not rocket science. Like the fact that, America lags our developed nation peers so far in terms of paid leave, not only paid family leave for new parents, but also paid sick leave, paid dependent care leave, right? Like that right there, that's a structural thing. The idea that we have such a weak publicly funded childcare system. So childcare is incredibly hard to find, incredibly expensive if you can find it, right? And childcare deserts are, again, much more likely to hit communities of color. That's another one where you can look at as a policy. I often talk about the idea of a child allowance. Like the fact is, raising kids increases the family budget, and you don't get any more money for doing it. And so most developed nations have basically a monthly allowance that's just sort of an unconditional cash transfer. Here's $300-400 a month per kid to help you deal with the fact that kids are expensive, and the society needs kids, and we need families and kids that are healthy, and so we're going to help you sort of compensate for so those are like structural resiliencies you can bring into place. If you had good paid leave, if you have good sort of workplace protections against just-in-time schedule changes, so you can't pull a parent away at a moment's notice, you have child allowance, if you have universal child care, like you could create sort of a superstructure around families that say, like, we're not going to let you fall too far. But that only gets you so far without the sort of social and cultural shifts, right? And I know you do a lot of thinking about this too, but there's also almost like a soul element to it, right? Like as a society, we don't necessarily prioritize families to children the way that we say that we do. Like we like to talk about how important that is, but if you look at the way that we make choices to prioritize keeping bars open instead of keeping schools open, I know it's a whole can of worms, but like whatever you think about the school issue, the fact is the bars are still open. And or like how do we even build our cities so that we're seeing lots of communities, right, at a time when outdoor activity is like the safest and like healthiest thing you can do. And if lots of, again, poor neighborhoods don't have access to safe green space or playgrounds or parks, right, and things like that. And so I think there's a way where we've ordered our society in a way that sort of almost leaves families at a disadvantage, families with children. That's a shift we're going to have to, I really think, reckon with, because the other thing we haven't talked about as much is before COVID ever hit and continuing on, like America's not having a lot of kids. And that's like actually on some level becomes an existential crisis for our society.
Well, Mr. Haspel, thank you so much for your time. I feel like we could talk for 10 more hours, and I'm just so grateful for your friendship, first of all, but also your brain and the way that you fight for equity and justice in these different categories facing families today. So thank you for all of those things, and thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. It's always good to talk to you.
Yeah, you too.
Demonstrate having your mind changed. This is especially important if you are particularly strong-willed or action-oriented. Your team needs to see that you can be influenced, and that no matter how unwavering you seem about a direction you've chosen, if they feel there's reason to raise concerns, you're willing to change your mind. Ask for pushback on your ideas, particularly the ones you feel strongest about. Insert pauses into your decision-making by telling your team you'll hold off on implementing them for 24 or 48 hours. while they consider and bring to you any risks. What issues or circumstances bring out your stubbornness? Where are you the most dogmatic about your viewpoints? Do people know you welcome being challenged? And if so, when? What ideas do you feel most strongly about and why? Think about it. Till next time, keep leaning into your moments of truth so that you can be the example of what it means to be honest.